He was also an advocate of the whole word method, and I'll introduce it here and we'll say more about it as we go on. The whole word method, it was introduced in Boston under Horace Mann, and it was such a disaster that it was pulled out within a few years because children were not learning how to read. So what is the whole word method? What is the look-say method? Sometimes they call it the sight method. To put it very succinctly, it's like trying to teach a child to read English as if it were Chinese. They're supposed to memorize lists of words, so you'll start with simple words like cat in the hat, and you remember, okay, when I see that combination of lines, that's supposed to mean cat. And so this is how you would read Chinese, right? You look at the word as a symbol rather than decoding what it says based on the phonetic structure and the letters and the sounds that the letters make to make up the whole word. So we have a phonetic alphabet. Obviously, our writing system is very different than the Chinese system. We don't use symbols to represent concepts and words. We use letters to create words. And to be able to decode those letters, you have to know what they sound like. An A sounds like eh or ah. A C and an H together sounds like ch. If you don't understand these things, you're never really going to learn how to read. You might be able to memorize a good amount of words, but you're never really reading. You're memorizing symbols. Now, when this was done in the schools in Boston, it was atrocious. It was a disaster. Again, they yanked it out within a few years because it was so bad. And so then it kind of died for a while. Now we know it produces dyslexia, it produces permanent reading disabilities, a hatred of reading. It makes children feel that they're stupid. Say, how come I can't read this? You know, I didn't memorize that word, so I don't know what that word says. And so, you know, here's actually an illustration of it here. You can see the picture of the fish, and underneath it says fish, and you're supposed to remember that when you see that combination of lines in that order, that means fish. So you're not reading F-I-S-H, and that sounds like fish. You're just memorizing it with a picture. Same thing with the fork there. So that's the whole word method in a nutshell. And it was developed with good intentions. It was developed by a reverend who wanted to teach deaf children how to read. They couldn't hear the phonetic sound of the words, and so that made sense to teach deaf children. But when you try to apply it to non-deaf children, you know, substandard doesn't begin to describe it. So this failed miserably, and it was buried for a very long time. And then came John Dewey. Maybe some of you guys have heard of him. There's a reason he's called the godfather or the father of progressive education, which is the education system we have all across this country today, paid for by our tax dollars. He was a socialist. He was open and very adamant about socialism. He wanted to move America to become a socialist country. He went to the Soviet Union and studied their schools there and thought they were doing a wonderful job mass-producing atheists and collectivists. He was also a humanist, one of the original humanists, one of the first signers of the Humanist Manifesto, which declared that the universe is self-existing and it was not created. And if you remember the Bible, it says in the beginning, God created. So, you know, these two are fundamentally at odds with each other. So John Dewey had big ideas. He wanted to change our country, fundamentally transform, might be a good way to put it in our day and age. If you remember Obama's rhetoric, he wants to fundamentally transform our country as well. But John Dewey did that first. So he came along. And he said, well, how am I going to do this? You know, we can't seize America like they seized the Soviet Union. You know, America is too literate. America is too smart. It's too well educated. They love their liberties. They love their Constitution. They're faithful to their God. This is never going to work over here. So he decided to seize control of the education system and dumb down the children. We have the primary source documents where he outlines his plan to dumb down the children, where he talks about, we don't need to teach little kids how to read. Let's focus on socializing them and making them social creatures and expanding the social consciousness. He considered reading to be an individualistic activity because when you read, it's just you and the book or whatever you're reading. So here's a quote from him. I had to take out a bunch because I'm very limited on time. Education is a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness. Is that what you think of as education? When I think of education, I think of reading and writing and arithmetic, not the process of coming to share in the social consciousness. But he says, adjustment of individual activity on the basis of social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction. So he wanted to reconstruct society. He wanted to engage in social reconstruction. To reconstruct, you need to destroy. And so he wanted to destroy the literacy of our people. And he succeeded, obviously. We'll talk about how in just a moment. He outlined parts of his plan in an essay that we actually reprinted in full in the book, The Primary Education Fetish, in 1898, and he blasted the current education regime that focuses on, regime is his word, that focuses on teaching young children how to read and how to write, and that's so superfluous. We need to make them social creatures. And you know, of course, a guy with wacky ideas like this would make a lot of friends at the elite universities. He got a nice position at the University of Chicago, took over some departments. Later, he went to the Teachers College at Columbia University. And of course, if you have wacky ideas like this, the Rockefellers will hand over some money. So they had a philanthropy called the General Education Board, and they gave him millions of dollars to try out this quackery in an experimental school and to promote this lunacy and to come up with a coalition of cohorts, many of whom were eugenicists, open racists. They claimed science justified their racism, and all of them were united in these beliefs of socialism and humanism and destroying the literacy and the faith of the people of the United States. So here he said in his essay, The Primary Education Fetish, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its success by favoring a violent reaction. Does that sound like a man with a good idea that he wants to present to the public? Absolutely not. He was very secretive. He wanted to do it quietly. He wanted to do it under the radar because he knew that if parents and if teachers figured out what he was up to, what his cohorts were up to, there would be a violent reaction and it would jeopardize the success of his plot. So the Dewey Plan, basically, the central element of it at least, was to promote this whole word method that we discussed earlier in all the government schools. He teamed up with a wide array of fellow humanists and socialists, a lot of whom studied under Wilhelm Wundt at the University of Leipzig, and they introduced behavioral psychology into the schools, where you treat the children as kind of animals, stimulus-response organisms, that you insert a stimulus and then they react in a certain way. Very Pavlovian. A lot, again, were eugenicists. Almost all of them were evolutionists and humanists. And Edward Burke Huey provided the pseudo-scientific quack basis for this kind of stuff. He said, oh, you know, Dewey's ideas will be great, and science says that, and we have to do this in all our schools. Of course, they seized control of, you know, two of the prominent teaching colleges, University of Chicago and Teachers College at Columbia. If those sound familiar, they should. Obama's terrorist buddy Bill Ayers comes from both of those. So they promoted those who had similar beliefs. They tried to get their operatives in charge of the public schools, and they developed reading programs. They came up with whole word books, the Dick and Jane readers. Some of you might remember those. They came up with the Macmillan reading program at Teachers College, and this was all designed to dumb down the American people, to reduce the literacy of the American people. Again, it was known to be quackery in the 1840s when they tried it in Boston. So John Dewey said that'll be perfect for our purposes. Obviously, this didn't happen overnight. It took a long time. During the Great Depression, the public schools were not really out on a buying spree, buying up these books. But eventually they did, after World War II, especially when the United States was the richest superpower in the world, tons of money extra lying around now that we don't have to fight the war. And so they said, okay, let's load up all the government schools with these books. Fortunately, thank goodness, a gentleman by the name of Rudolf Flesch in 1955 wrote a book exposing this. He said, Why Johnny Can't Read. And this is actually one of the books that set Sam, Dr. Blumenfeld, on his lifelong mission of bringing attention to this crucial issue. So again, you know, it was known to be quackery in the 1840s. Again, it was exposed in 1955, and you probably won't be surprised to learn that this is still going on in government schools across the country, even though the effects are known, even though we can look on brain scans now. You can do a brain scan on children who have done phonics versus children who have done the whole word method. And what you see is that the brain of someone who learned how to read with the whole word method is wired wrong. It doesn't work as well. It has physical brain damage because you're trying to get the right hemisphere of the brain to do a function that the left hemisphere of the brain is supposed to be doing. Symbols is for the right side of the brain. Reading and writing is for the left side of the brain. When you try to do it backwards, you get brain damage, you get dyslexia, you get the connections wired wrong. And this doesn't just affect literacy. This affects a wide array of other areas. And modern neuroscientists who don't share any of the beliefs that I have confirmed all of this. So fast forward to today. Dr. Pest is going to be talking to you about Common Core and how we got here and what this means. So I'm going to skip over that, and we're just going to move straight to UNESCO and the ideas that these people have for our